China has seen its fortunes rise from a closed agrarian society 40 years ago to a modern high-tech society where even the most remote inhabitants are synced up to the latest apps. However, either by apathy or hostility, Western general perceptions have not appreciated this peaceful story. They see something is amiss. Either China is backward or China is a competitor, rarely a friendly equal partner. What is China really like? American Bill Brown has lived in China for over 30 years and had a front row seat to China's story. He drove around China twice to even the most remote areas and saw how people's lives have been transformed. Earlier, I spoke to Professor Brown, who has lived in Xiamen, Fujian province in eastern China since 1988, who is now with the School of Management in Xiamen University. It's been 13 years since we last talked. A lot has happened. But, you know, the latest is the meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Bali, Indonesia.
I was happy to see that.
Yes. Did you pay attention? I'm sure you paid attention to that. What's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that regardless of the outcome, it's important that they met. I think it's face to face. It's easy in the media to take a political stance, but face to face, it's harder to keep that hard-headedness, that distance. When I get angry with my wife, she'd always hold my hand, and I hated her holding my hand when I was angry, but I'd soften up. And finally, she told me after years the secret. She said, it's hard to stay angry with somebody you're holding hands with. I thought that was wisdom. And so I think it's long overdue that Biden and Xi Jinping meet face to face.
You came to mainland China in 1988. You've seen practically, you know, the whole process and the relationship between China and the United States wax and wane.
Yes.
Was there a point that you can recall that you were going like, oh my goodness, why, how, why is things like that? Was there such a moment ever?
Well, I was really disappointed because I felt like because I was in Taiwan in the 70s and I saw the relationship between the US and mainland China before that. And then I saw the turnaround after 78, and then it seemed like things were getting better. And then all of a sudden, it's hard to find out what the turning point was, but all of a sudden this anti-China rhetoric. And what really surprised me, it used to be one party. And then the past 2 years, it's kind of both parties going back and forth on it. And I was really shocked by that. But the thing is not too shocked because it's the bottom line is an economic issue. It's a trade issue. And we like to say it's human rights or democracy or environment. We say all these things. But over the decades in China, I've read a lot about Chinese history and the relationship between the US and China. And I've traveled all over China and seen the changes. And it amazes me how little has changed in some countries' attitudes and actions over the past 200 years. Let me show you a book.
Okay.
This is The Breakup of China. It was hard to find this book. It's big and heavy.
Yeah.
But this book was published in 1899. And at that time, this is like a catalog of all the different provinces of China and all the assets that the Europeans and Americans would get if they broke up China, like they'd broken up Africa. And they published this book, and to justify it, in the book, they talked about all of China's problems. I'm in Fujian, which is famous for tea for 1,000 years. And in the book, they talked about tea in Fujian and how the Chinese didn't know how to grow or market tea. So the Europeans, to save the Chinese, were going to do this. But to do such a thing, to try and break up an ancient country like this, how do you justify it? The same year that they published this breakup of China, they also published several books, China, the Yellow Peril, China at War with the World, presenting China as this great danger to the world.
So you're seeing a cycle. You're seeing this reoccurring at this moment.
It's a cycle. Yeah, it's a reoccurrence. And I was surprised to find that the U.S. first instance of talking about human rights in China, sadly, was the first Opium War. Former President John Adams trying to get the Americans to support the first Opium War. He went around drumming up support, and he said that China's restrictions on trade was a violation of the rights of men and nations. That's the first mention of human rights. But he didn't mention that China was only restricting trade in opium, nothing else. The emperor said we welcome trade in anything except opium. But so
it was very selective in what
very
they.
selective.
Yeah.
And it really amazed me though when I saw this book and saw the same year that they had published China at War with the World. At that time, the Western countries were here really tearing China apart like they did in Africa, and yet they presented China as a danger.
What is China in your eyes? Because China is not perfect. You know, this is just like every other
No,
country. It is
yeah.
not perfect. So how would you tell your friends in America what China really is? Because a lot of them, from watching the things you just mentioned, from listening to the news, their impression is being swayed by this kind of narrative. So what is China? It's not a perfect place, obviously.
No, I've driven over the 30 something years. I've driven personally about 200,000 kilometers around China. I've even driven through the Gobi Desert to Mongolia to Tibet before they had good roads to see face to face. I didn't want to rely on Chinese media or foreign media. I wanted to see face to face what is China really like. And I saw a lot of problems, but I also saw a lot of good. I wasn't surprised by the problems. Such a big country and so many people, you're going to have problems. But the difference with China, and I've read this through history and I've read it now, and I appreciate this, is that for example, when they said China was the yellow peril, the threat to the world, that was ironic because even though all the Western countries, the US was here in China taking it apart, Chinese had never at that point gone to a distant country to do anything to them. And yet they were saying China was the threat to the world.
Right, here is a dilemma or impossible paradox, because China says we will not seek hegemony. We are not going to be expansionist. We are not going to seek sphere of influence. But you know, a Western commentator would say, well, how do we know about the future? You know, your past record can never prove that you're not going to do something in the future. So William, how do you look at this? Having been in China for 30 some years, what can you tell these people? I mean, I'm out of words. I know that we are a peaceful country. We have thousands of years, the opportunity to occupy another piece of land. We didn't do that. But what would you say? How do you say it?
Well, this is the thing. For example, right now, Taiwan. I thought it's so funny when the media headlines said that Russia invading Ukraine gives the mainland the opportunity to now invade Taiwan. Well, give me a break. If China wanted to take Taiwan, they could have taken it in 50 years ago, 60 years ago. When I was in Taiwan in the 70s, I was in the US Air Force in Taiwan from 76 to 78, and I thought I was there to defend Taiwan. And I was so afraid when I went to Taiwan, I knew I was going to go to war and die. So I gave my car to my sister because I thought I'd die of war in Taiwan. I did go back to the US 2 years later. She still hasn't given back my car. but but I saw all this fear in the 70s. And all these years they talk about Taiwan, mainland being a threat to Taiwan. But seriously, China is a peaceful country. And even I love Sun Tzu's Art of War. I wrote a book for Beijing University Press, a textbook, the Art of Business Warfare, and I used Sun Tzu's Art of Warfare. And that's the best manual for warfare. But the Art of War, the best history manual, the best manual in history about war, says avoid war if possible. War is the last resort. Use peaceful means. And Chinese throughout history have done that. To show you how things don't change, let me show you something that I read that just amazes me. Is in July 1891, here in Xiamen, on July 4th, we celebrated July 4th, US independence, and the Fujian governor gave a toast to America in Xiamen, and he said, this is brilliant, he could have been a prophet. He said, Chinese, having followed its own principles of advancement during more than 5,000 years, is now compelled to change and move along European channels. And he said, it has begun its own steamships and railways. Its telegraph now covers every province, mills, forges, etc. He said, China is today learning that lesson in education which Europe has obliged her to learn, the art of killing, the science of armies and navies. Actually, China knew that long ago. China had weapons unimaginable 1,000 years ago, but they used them only for defense. He said, woe then, this is the Fujian governor, 130 years ago, woe then to the world if the scholar, profiting by her lesson, should apply it in turn. With its freedom from debt, its inexhaustible resources, and its teeming millions, this empire, China, might be the menace, if not the destroyer, of Christendom. But then he says this, no matter what happens, it needs no prophetic gift to know that the 20th century will see at the forefront of the nations China in the East and America in the West. Well, may we pray that for the welfare of humanity, their purposes will be as peaceful and upright as today. First time I read that, I cried because he was so sincere. And they really did hope that the US and China would work East and West for just, upright principles. And then what happened?
Although there are some signs of relief, but things are not rosy, to say the least. Right after the meeting between President Biden and President Xi, you have Vice President Harris talking about, again, stepping on red lines that China has set. And what worries me the most is the public opinion, not just in the United States, but in other Western countries where unfavorability of China has gone up considerably over the past few years. According to, for instance, Pew Research, 82% of people in 2022 surveyed in Western countries actually are unfavorable about China. So this is the result. What accounts for this? I'm not going to put my opinion in your words. What accounts for this?
Okay.
What to do, how to get out of it? What can China do?
Well, the big problem is, as Xi Jinping has said several times, 21 years ago in Fuzhou, when Xi Jinping was our governor, he gave me honorary citizen of Fujian. And at dinner that night, he said, China understands the world, but the world doesn't understand China. We need to better tell China's story. And he encouraged me to write more books at that time.
Are we doing that job well? It seems that we're not doing that job very well, given the rating.
I think we're getting better. I think we're getting better at it. But the problem is, and this again, leaders of China, including Xi Jinping, have mentioned many times, is that the West controls the media. I mean, how could they say 120 years ago that they're breaking up China, but China is the threat to the world? And they said that, and people accepted that because the media was controlled, and they control it today as well. So it's hard to get China's story out there. I mean, when I go back to the US or I leave China, I'm in another country and I read the headlines, wow, it's horrifying. And if I didn't know the truth for myself and I hadn't been here, and how do people know any better?
Yeah.
They don't know. When I first came to China and saw what the country was like and what the people were like, I was shocked how different it was from what the media portrayed. I started writing about it, and my family and friends were angry about it. So here's the problem, though. Some journalists have asked me, how can we overcome the Western media's negative portrayal of China? I think at this point, it's not easy to. I mean, you've heard the phrase that history is written by the victors, right? Mm-hmm. Well, there's another thing I've added to that. Today's news is written by the victors' descendants. They have the power, they have the money, they control the network. But I think actions speak louder than words.
Yeah. Professor Brown, I'm going to ask this one last question. It's a little bit personal, but I am curious because there are actually quite a number of people who are like you, who are really friendly to China and known China for years and years and years. But if I going to ask you one thing that you still haven't gotten used to here in China, is there one? What would it be, if so?
If there's one thing I haven't got used to in China.
It's a difficult one.
That's a hard question because I've been here 34 years and, goodness, I wish I had a heads up on that question.
Well, that shows that you're so comfortable, you're so used to the life.
The thing is this is home, and I appreciate the spirit of the people. I appreciate the warm-heartedness, that it's family, one big family, and every time I leave the country, every time I leave Xiamen, I go to another place. When I come back, I just feel, I'm back. So I can't really think of anything that I still feel uncomfortable with. I'm sure there are things, but I don't think about them. Yeah.
Well, that's the spirit you need to have when you're living in a different country. You immerse yourself right in that lifestyle. Thank you so much. We have to leave it there. Professor William Brown joining us from Xiamen University. Thank you.